This is Tandy McConnell, and today we're talking about ancient China. When I was talking about ancient Egypt a few days ago, I suggested that while we pretty much take kings and presidents and bureaucrats for granted, their ability to govern rests on a fairly limited basis. People have to accept their authority. If one or two people rebel against the king's authority by not paying their taxes or by driving their chariots on the wrong side of the road, then dealing with them is not that difficult. Any king or emperor worthy of the name has the ability to compel obedience of a few people using some kind of police force or military power, or sometimes just persuasion, as in, if you know what's good for you, you will pay your taxes and behave yourself. Otherwise, some of my guys are going to come over and discuss things with you, and you won't like it. Without a degree of fear and intimidation, no government can function. The real problem for kings is to persuade the great masses of people to do as the king desires. Fear will only take a king so far. The Egyptian pharaohs persuaded their people to pay their taxes and put their backs into the construction of pyramids and whatnot by presenting themselves to the masses as gods on earth. The Sumerian kings took the line that kingship was a gift of the gods, and the king was designated by heaven as a shepherd and benefactor of the people. Conflicts between cities and kingdoms were portrayed as conflicts among the gods. If one city was defeated by another, the gods of the defeated city were taken captive as well and hauled to the temple of the victorious god to do homage to the greater god. Among conquering empires, it seems that only the Persians had enough confidence in their god, Ahura Mazda, to permit conquered people to retain their own gods, temples, and religious traditions. The civilization that grew up along the banks of the Yellow and Yangtze River, China, the Middle Kingdom, dealt with these same problems as hunting and gathering gave way to agriculture, village-based economies, and eventually to cities, kingdoms, and empires. While China has certainly had its ups and downs, if you were to visit China today, either a great city like Beijing or a remote village, you would find evidence of a cultural continuity that goes back at least 3,000 years. The China of Confucius continues to thrive today, even as China has been transformed from an agricultural, paternalistic society into whatever it has become. Big, complex, self-confident, communist, capitalist, agrarian, industrialized, impoverished, and wealthy, all at once. For all of its contradictions, the traditions that made China into a great power have not been erased by a half-century of communism, nor by the decade-long Cultural Revolution under Chairman Mao Zedong, which was devoted to getting rid of all that was old-fashioned and traditional in China. The boring way to frame Chinese history is to say that agriculture was invented in China a few thousand years after it was invented in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and that it took similar form, cultivating plants that were indigenous to the area, especially rice, and herding such animals that did not object overmuch to being herded together, like pigs, chickens, and ducks, and eventually like silkworms. Mesopotamia and Egypt provided their own legends and myths to justify the expansion of centralized power over local peasants, undoubtedly as did the Harappans. The Chinese stories of origin serve to tell us what was important to the Chinese, and perhaps what continues to be important. History, in a legendary, semi-mythical sort of way, begins in China with three semi-mythical and legendary individuals who taught the Chinese the arts of civilization around 2800 to 2600 BCE. In Chinese thought, these are the three cultural heroes. The first of these is Fu Xi, who is credited in the traditions with being the inventor of writing, hunting, trapping, and fishing. Shen Nung was the inventor of agriculture and of commerce, and is the ancestor of the Han Chinese, who are by far the largest ethnic group in China, and of the Vietnamese. The third is the Yellow Emperor, who brought the blessings of government to China, and is credited as well with being the first Taoist philosopher. The period of the three cultural heroes was followed by that of the three sage kings, Yao, Shun, and Yu, who ruled with perfect wisdom, clarity, and virtue. The era of the sage kings in the middle of the 3rd century BCE was the most virtuous period in Chinese history. According to the Chinese histories, the last of these sage kings, Yu, founded a dynasty of kings, the Xia, The Xia began their rule with virtue and wisdom and ended with the rule of Jia, who was extravagantly decadent and cruel, riding his servants as if they were horses and killing them when they could go no further. In 1766 BCE, after 400 years of rule, the Xia dynasty was overthrown by the Tang, who began a new dynasty, the Shang. It's really easy to dismiss all this talk of sage kings and cultural heroes as myths. After all, it seems unlikely that a single person could have invented hunting, trapping, fishing, and in his spare time, riding. The first three had been known for hundreds. The first three of these have been known for hundreds of thousands of years. Technically, we should probably call the stories legendary, since they probably began with a seed of history that they do not credit, and they also do not credit the gods with anything. By the time we get to the Shang dynasty, legend begins to give way to history. Tang, a man of great virtue and wisdom, overthrew the decadent Emperor Jia, the last of the Xia dynasty, around 1600 BCE. Like the previous dynasty, the Shang themselves eventually declined and ended with the ignominious rule of the last Shang king. He was overthrown by King Wen and his son Wu, who began the third dynasty of China, the Zhou, which lasted from 1056 to 256 BCE. It seems likely that a cyclical understanding of history was already a part of Chinese self-understanding. The first of the Zhou kings, Wen and Wu, took advantage of this idea of a cyclical history to justify overthrowing the Shang and establishing their own dynasty, as if to say, I'm not really just an ambitious rebel, I'm doing the will of heaven. This idea was developed by the Zhou into the idea called the mandate of heaven. Dynastic families rise to power because heaven, in Chinese Tian, has called them to lead China. As long as they are virtuous and just and maintain right relations with their ancestors, then they will maintain the mandate of heaven and will have a claim on the obedience of all Chinese. But if, as with the Xia, they become corrupt, lazy, and forget to honor their ancestors, then they will lose the blessings of heaven. Enemies will attack, drought or floods will make life miserable for the peasants who will either perish or rebel against their rulers. Seeing that the mandate is lost, a rival dynasty will emerge and challenge the corrupt rulers, eventually establishing their own virtuous dynasty, which will, just as certainly, follow the same path from virtue to corruption to collapse. The Zhou expanded the borders of China far beyond the realm of the legendary Xia, or the not quite as legendary Shang. Because it is impossible for a single emperor to govern a large empire alone, the Zhou developed two institutions to hold society together, feudalism and bureaucracy. Feudal princes governed local city-states, at least nominally on behalf of the Zhou emperors. The princes were kept honest by a cadre of bureaucrats who were often commoners who rose to power on the strength of their intelligence and their ability to keep the emperors happy. Eventually, in order to prevent the bureaucrats from simply passing down their status to their sons, and thereby creating a new sort of nobility that the emperors could not easily control, membership in the bureaucracy came to depend on passing a civil service exam. This was not as fair as it might sound. The civil service exams were brutal, demanding a perfect recollection of thousands of pages of text. Many of these texts were obscure and hundreds of years old. Since only the sons of wealthy families could afford to spend the years and study necessary to memorize these texts, it was impossible for even the brightest of peasants and unthinkable for any woman to enter the imperial bureaucracy and become powerful, wealthy, and respected. The last 2 centuries, about 475 to 221 of the Zhou dynasty, is called the Warring States period, for the unsurprising reason that imperial power had weakened and local nobles, or warlords as we like to think of them in the West, began exerting independent authority and tried to take over their neighbors. This was not an especially convenient time to be a peasant, but warfare tends to take on a life of its own in such circumstances until Qin Ying, a warlord from the state of Qin, defeated all of the competing warlords and established a unified Chinese state for the first time. He was in many ways the first real Chinese emperor, even though his dynasty only lasted from 221 to 206 BCE. The next dynasty to seize power, however, the Han, lasted from 206 BCE until 207 CE, after which their histories become even more complicated. More important than understanding this succession of dynasties is to understand the idea that underlay Chinese civilization. These ideas we're going to talk about are the Tao, Confucianism, the mandate of heaven, and legalism. Taoism can be understood as a religion, and a great many people worship at Taoist temples, or as can be considered a philosophy, or even as a science, though not in the Western way of thinking about science. Since Taoists believe that the Tao, which means the way, can neither be defined nor named, it puts us at a loss trying to explain it. If we think of the Tao as the underlying principle of nature, or the underlying principle of the universe, we're probably not too far off. The basic tenets of Taoism are attributed to a legendary figure named Lao Tzu, who lived probably in the 6th century BCE. The book that's credited to him is called the Tao Te Ching, or the Book of Changes. The idea is something like this, and I'll use a personal story to try to give an example. Once, when I was a whole lot younger and a lot more athletic, I was called upon to help rescue a little boy who had gotten stuck on a rock in the middle of a modestly dangerous river in the rapids. I was downstream and immediately jumped in and started swimming up towards the little boy. Although I was a good swimmer, I didn't make a lot of progress, but I think I did look pretty cool in the process. Meanwhile, another guy, not nearly as athletic as me, casually picked up a life jacket and waded into the water upstream from the boy. He floated effortlessly down to where the kid was, put the life jacket on him, and then sent him on downstream to me. Obviously, I did not then understand the Tao. I was struggling against nature rather than trying to move with it. Something similar happens in Tai Chi, the very gentle martial art that is practiced every morning by millions of Chinese men and women. Unlike boxing or karate, where the goal is to smack someone very hard, the goal of Tai Chi is to move with the flow of energy, that is the Qi, that is inside you and inside your opponent and that pervades the universe. Taoism pervades traditional Chinese cooking, where the goal is to find a balance between hot and cold, sweet and sour, crunchy and soft. In Taoism, to live a good life is to live in harmony with nature and with one's neighbors and within oneself. Even in Chinese traditional medicine, the goal is not to cure an illness as in the Western sense. Rather, acupuncture and herbal teas and massage are used to restore the flow and balance of the qi that permeates all living things. Confucius, who also lived in the 6th century BCE, was less interested in the nature of things in general than he was in how people might get along with one another. He was a political philosopher and spent much of his professional career trying to find a job as an advisor to one warlord or another, never with a great deal of success. Only in the centuries after his death were his maxims collected by his students and the students of his students. For Confucius, the goal of life was to maintain proper relationships. The most important thing anyone could do is to honor one's parents, especially to honor one's father. Because the emperor is the father of the whole Chinese nation, then all people should honor the emperor, and the emperor should honor his ancestors. If everyone maintains right relationships, then everyone will live in harmony, and life will be good. Although Confucius continues to be reflected in Chinese political and social thinking today, it was opposed by the Qin dynasty emperors who favored a less optimistic view of human nature and a philosophy of governance called legalism. The legalists believed that people are, by nature, inclined to rebel. The only thing that keeps people in line, that prevents rebellion and general chaos, is a sure threat of punishment for the slightest infractions. The Qin drove this point home by burying a few Confucianist teachers alive and burning the Confucianist writings. It might not be too much of a stretch to suggest that even in modern China, the goals of Confucianism and legalism are still fighting it out for the Chinese mind.